Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Carissa Carter and Scott Doorley, and we're both at the D.school. And I think, Scott, you are the creative director, and Carissa, you are the academic director of the D.school. I should preface this for those who are not in the know that Stanford's D.school, the D stands for design, right? And it is the prototypical design school, the one that I think all of the other schools are trying to copy. I mean, I don't know enough about the history, but I'm guessing that it is really the first school to call itself a design school, or first department, even though it is an extension, I guess, originally of the mechanical engineering, and has wandered back, right? But highly, highly interdisciplinary. And also, you guys are the co-authors of this book called Assembling Tomorrow, A Guide to Designing a Thriving Future. Welcome, and thanks for joining.
Thanks so much for having us, Greg. It's great to be here.
Great to be here.
Now, of course, you guys are actually probably like 3 feet away from each other with the wall.
If we could get through the floor, I think we'd be right in the same space.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I guess the design, you guys need to think about designing a new studio for this sort of thing. But I guess what I wanted to ask you guys first is, look, this concept of design, it's kind of become everything and nothing. I think nowadays people toss this term around. Design thinking went from something which was a relatively niche thing, a relatively new thing, to something that I think everybody knows something about. I think pretty much every business person, every business student, and maybe even students in other disciplines have encountered some of the rudimentary insights behind design thinking. But as it's expanded and grown, it's kind of comes around full circle, and it becomes like, I don't know, a form of common sense, right? I mean, a form of system thinking. I think one of the main points of your book is to get people to think about unintended consequences, to get people to think about spillovers, to get people to think about trade-offs between different objectives, to rethink the costs and benefits of constraints. And the more I read about these things, the more I realize that's kind of what we're all trying to teach, in whether we're in business schools or engineering schools or even in law schools. So to what extent has, design thinking eaten the world, right? to paraphrase Mark Andreessen?
I mean, I think one thing that I'll latch on to from your description is that design is much more pervasive than it ever was. So 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I mean, when I started as a designer, I hadn't had any previous awareness that design was even a discipline. And now I'm sitting here with you 20-ish years later from my design origin story, and I can very confidently tell you that absolutely everything has been designed. So whether you are a person that designs things or systems or technologies, whether or not that you call yourself a designer, in your job title, if you are a part of making things and bringing them into the world, that's design work. And it's really important to pay attention to that.
Yeah, and you've hit, Greg, I think on a little bit of a paradox, which is, yes, everything is design, right? Like everything we do all day, if we're doing it with intention and we're creating a plan to kind of make things work in a certain way with a certain intent, that is design, right? But getting good at design and doing design well is another story. And I think the difference sort of between how you might teach a similar process in business or even in engineering, even though we're in the School of Engineering, is that design's really focused on desirability. What do we want in the world? Should this exist? That becomes kind of the thrust for all the decision making around the stuff that you create. And it's not to say that that's not part of business or part of engineering. It's just a stronger focus in design. And that's actually like a really big challenge. It's very hard to stick to making sure it's the thing we want into the world because the thing that we want to put into the world because we get pulled in so many directions, whether that's like incentive to make money or just, the difficulty of bringing something to fruition or people who don't understand what you're trying to do. So there's a lot to navigate. And so it's a very deep field as well as being totally accessible.
Well, we talk about the practical arts, which include things like medicine and business engineering, and what they have in common is that they are both kind of descriptive and prescriptive, right? They are analytical and practical, so they both describe the world and try to change the world. And I think of design being like that, even though most people think of it as here's how you design. But as you point out in the book, everything is designed. And so whether it's intentional or not, and so Chris, I'm wondering, you said that you've come to realize that design is everywhere. I mean, is that because people are becoming more intentional, or is it because you're kind of more aware of the intent, whether conscious or subconscious, that kind of permeates everything? That, a knowledge that everything is a product of somebody's decision at some point. Is there sort of a descriptive aspect of what we call design?
Yeah, I think our ways of making are far more accessible and widespread and easier to access than they ever have been before. So the general populace, as people that make and build things, like that's increasing. Also, in parallel with that, like the speed of which at which our creations can launch and scale in the world is increasing faster and faster, right? So we're all like higher degree of makers. What we're making spreads quickly and farther than ever before. So there is a background context of the world that is making all of us more aware of our powers as designers. But then I think like we could look inwardly at the same time at what design is and how it functions, and in particular, the interconnectivity between things that are often siloed within organizations. And I often use this device as an example for that. So I'm holding up a cell phone here, which obviously this is a product that was designed, the radius of the corners were chosen, like the materials, the glass, like all people made design decisions about this as a design thing. And then if I open it up, like there's all these digital products that were designed too on here, each one of these apps. Like, and there's a lot of types of design work that went into it, from the UI flow of every single one of those apps to the experiences that they create. So there's the product, but then it's like the experience of using it. The fact that you can have that video call with somebody on the other side of the world, like somebody designed how that happens. So there's the products, there's the experiences, there's the systems that this thing nests within. As a Stanford employee, I'm a cog in this system. And, I have the security software on here that I get from this university. I have an AT&T phone plan that decides where in this country I get better service and where I have dropped calls. And if I want new applications, I get them from an app store that is itself a system of design. So products, experiences, systems, and then embedded within that, there's the technologies, clearly that power everything that's on this device. If you were going to text me with the name Carissa, it likely would autocorrect for you to carrot or carcass because my name, right, is slightly off of the Western canon of names, right? Because somebody designed the data set that then goes into those technologies. And right, and that autocorrect learns, right? You do that 3 times, you don't get the red squiggle anymore. So somebody designed that interaction. So the data, the tech, the product, the experience, the system, they're highly interconnected. Our organizations often, you might identify with like, I'm a systems designer, or like I'm a systems engineer, or I'm somebody that codes and builds algorithms. The reality though all of this stuff is interrelated and has consequences, like some profound, right? There's people that have been able to band together and cause amazing change in their communities with applications on this phone. And those same applications have enabled mass amounts of school bullying, right? So some things have like really important consequences. Some things we may joke at with my like name autocorrecting is something funny, right? But there's times when like what isn't designed in a data set, it's not okay. And so being able to talk through the consequences of our work, no matter what level and how it connects, like that's what design is. It's messy. There's all these different rules for how it works together. And, while we want this to be accessible to a lot of people, we need all of us like also thinking deeply about how it's working and when it's not.
Well, first I want to say I'm amazed at how few apps you have on your phone. Like, I was looking at that. I mean, I think designers are neat people. I have like mine is just overstuffed with apps. But Scott, I want to follow up on this because you quote in the book. I don't think you attributed this to Winston Churchill, right? But I think he said, we make buildings and then the buildings make us, or we shape our environment and then the environment shapes us. And I think this is one of the themes of the book, about how much our world is shaped by the designs of other people. I mean, is part of your job, as you see it, to get people to be kind of more aware of how they are in fact shaped by other people's design choices? And if so, does that awareness then lead one to be more, I guess, responsible about the design choices that they make? And I should mention that both of you have written books. Both of you have written books on. One of you wrote a book on maps, and another one wrote a book on space. And I should, maps and space. Those two things have a huge impact on how we navigate the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, literally, yeah. And I think the thing I think about a lot is when I became a designer, I really wanted to learn how to make the things that we live with. And then once I did that, I really started wondering, how do we live with the things that we make? And so you're pointing at exactly the right thing, Greg, which is to say that the things that we do create, they do have just this oversized impact on us. And if we can be aware of it, then we have a lot more agency just in that awareness to decide how we interact with things. So as an example, like I devour YouTube, like just have it on in the background when I'm doing dishes, folding laundry, out for a run, whatever. I just have, podcasts, YouTube playing constantly. I've started actually, after writing this book, getting in the habit of like just checking in to see like, how is this thing I'm consuming making me feel? And then I note, oh, wait, it's actually not making me feel that good. I feel like I like it, I gravitate towards it, but it's not really making me feel that good. So I try to do less of that one. And just in that tiny act of like, how's this making me feel? You then have agency to say like, I don't turn it off, right? Because you're aware. But a lot of times you don't, right? You're tired, you just want some entertainment, you get in there, and then like hours later, you've been scanning through, the same thing over and over, and you realize you just wasted hours and whatever. Or something worse, you've started down like some sort of internet rabbit hole and, you're into conspiracy theory land. But just having the awareness of it, it breaks you right out. It's a very simple thing that's profoundly impactful.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, in the book, you talk about a number of different themes, one of which is connections, right? And I think there are people that have a tendency to think in terms of systems, and there are others that kind of have a tendency to focus on much narrower scope. I mean, is there a place for both ways of thinking? I mean, specializing in one type of thinking versus the other. I mean, in engineers, there are engineers that they learn how to tackle some, very little thing, and they sort of expect somebody else to figure out how it interacts with the other parts of the system. And I always wonder, are we kind of over indexing on specialists? We don't have people whose job it is to sort of focus on the connections, focus on bridging the silos. Even in medicine, right? The generalists are kind of at the bottom of the, the pecking order. Do we need to kind of, I don't know, reprioritize or kind of boost the status of folks who are in this more system thinking orchestration role?
I think maybe we could argue that that is the job of leadership, right? To be able to see the big picture and articulate the details at the same time. When we talk about that skill, which is one that we actually actively practice in design work, we talk about moving between the abstract and the concrete. And that does take work to be able to articulate that grand vision and what might be, and then be able to zoom way into here's what we might do to make that happen. And there's some of the techniques that we talk about in the book, like for example, one of them is using metaphors to articulate, like, here's how I want my system to run, or like if my organization was set up like a solar system, who would be the sun, or like what group within the orb would be the sun, like what would the like near orbiting planets be, what would the comet that comes once every 80,000 years be, right? And so you use that metaphor as a way of talking about how that system is structured, and then that can allow you to drill down into, well, here's the things that matter: that sun stays glowing, right, that energy stays flowing and prominent. And then when the comet does come, like that means that we all pay attention to it and go out and we look, and like it's this phenomenon that happens every once in a while, right? It allows you to say, like, I take this structure, and if this was my world, here's how it might run. And then you do the same thing with your org, with same org, and say like, well, okay, well, if it was set up like a river, like how, like what would the curves be? Like what would the rapids be? What would it be eroding? What would it be depositing? So using metaphors as a device to both talk through, like, here's the vibe that I want this project or this org to have, and here's some of the specific details as to how it might function. Like that's just one easy way into abstract to concrete thinking.
Yeah, it's funny when you talk about this. I keep thinking you're talking about business strategy, right? So in my strategy class, I say the most important skill is to learn how to, go general and go specific. I mean, I'm doing organizational design, and you guys are usually focusing on a different type of design, but they sound like very, very similar projects.
Yeah, I think organizational design is a completely valid and not really recognized as design thing to do, but it's the design of the things to be designed, right? Like it's meta design. It's like it might be even like the most important thing you can design, because then everything else comes out of that. And I think your point too, which I'm hearing both of you say, this ability to really go big and go detailed, it can't be overstated, because that's where things start to feel congruent, right? If I say, oh, my organization believes in X, but that's not coming through in the way someone's greeted when they come to the door, it's just going to feel off, and it just doesn't feel right. It just doesn't feel good. So that ability to be like, okay, not only are we going to have a vision, but we're going to embed it in the day-to-day that we do. I think that's one of the, you could think of that as parenting. That's sort of how a teacher sets up a classroom. That's clearly how a leader should lead an organization, in my opinion, because then you don't have to talk about the values. They're there. And it's a hard thing to do. Like sometimes sometimes I feel like we're on it. Sometimes I feel like we're missing the mark. It's not a static thing. You have to keep iterating and keep responding to what's going on.
Now, you also talk about the importance of being disoriented, right? And, being awkward. And, I oftentimes say that if you're not uncomfortable, then you're probably not learning anything. But it seems like normally when we think of design as attempting to achieve perfection, attempting to achieve balance, right? Attempting to achieve some kind of beauty that's maybe rested on symmetry or whatever. I mean, how important is it that we embrace this idea of awkwardness, of discomfort, of imbalance?
I think it's everything, right? I think, you ask about importance. Well, Scott and I have been talking about this book a lot, and what we have come to realize that really this our whole book's about seeing the unseen. Okay. And what are the ways that we can tune ourselves to see things that have, for whatever reason, escaped our notice, themselves in our peripheral vision, turned into assumptions in our own head. And that disorientation that you're talking about, of which one of them is like both being and noticing awkwardness and when things aren't fitting, right? That's one of those moments that help you see the unseen. Well, the next time that you find yourself in an awkward situation, like, instead of like trying to make it go away right away, like, what if you just leaned into it a little bit more? Right. And I love awkwardness. I kind of like love kind of messing with it a little bit to see if I can lean into it myself in a way that, I'm not saying that everybody has to do that, but like, where does it land in your body? Right. Are you feeling out of sync because you're in a culture of people that like has norms that you don't know, right? And then how might you learn them? Like, is that a design opportunity there? Like, when there's a gap in that understanding, like, that's often an opportunity. So there's a lot of things you can pay attention to with something like awkwardness.
Yeah, I think awkwardness and imperfection are kind of the keys because awkwardness, as Chris was saying, that's where the ideas and the possibility lies, right? Like if it's working, there's nothing to be designed, right? It's working. You just need to enjoy it and get into it. It's when you're in the awkward situation that there's some opportunity there. And then the thing about imperfection is even if you get it right, it's only temporary. You know, if you get it right, so-called right, something's going to change outside of you that's going to render it not effectual in some matter of time, or you're going to get that right, but you're going to miss something else. I was talking to a guy who teaches here, and he teaches entrepreneurs, and he was saying like, you're going to fail somewhere. It might be at your business, it might be at your family, it might be at your health. But if you're, really trying to do something hard, there's going to be failure. And so you just have to get used to it, acknowledge it, and then work with it. You got to accept it as part of the design because it is.
Yeah, I don't know who was it, someone famous who said that all scientific discovery starts with noticing something weird, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of strange. That
Right.
doesn't really
Yeah.
make sense.
Yeah. We
Yeah.
have we have a teacher here who teaches what we call need finding, Michael Barry, who's been teaching here
Oh
for
yeah,
years.
I
And
know
he
him.
says like it like comes with a like there's a like that notion that something's a little off, that or the weirdness, that's where it begins.
Yeah, when I teach stuff on design, and there's the 4-stage process, 5-stage process. I know, you guys have your patented 5-stage process. Like, I never seem to get past noticing because it seems like, if you can't do that, then none of the other stuff really even matters, right? Forget about ideation, forget about experimentation, and that seems to be the place where, most people have the biggest obstacle is just becoming noticers. Why do you suppose that is? I mean, why do people have, I guess, a reluctance or why are people out of the habit of putting themselves in the position of a noticer?
I think it takes energy to notice, right? And we've all got like finite places where we can put our attention, and notice takes work. And like, that's where we also like to think that we just know the answers, right? But really embedding and understanding and doing that backdrop of looking and seeing work, like, takes serious time and energy. So I think like that's why it's often something that is overlooked. I'll say what I think is even more overlooked is time to make sense of the information we've gathered. So how are we synthesizing our observations that may be anecdotal with our more formal data sets that we tend to trust more if they're numeric and quantitative more than qualitative, right? How are we really spending time synthesizing these disparate types of information? That's where like really noticing through those patterns, like that's where I think where a lot of leaps happen, and we often skip because it's difficult to do.
So it may not just be that noticing is difficult and requires a lot of effort, but what happens afterwards is going to require a lot of effort. And so you just kind of cut it off at the pass and say, look, I don't want to start noticing because that's going to create a lot of problems for me. And then I'm going to have to, figure out what to do, whatever I noticed.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's when you mix the sort of discovery with the need to bring it to fruition, it's really, really difficult because you immediately, every time you discover something, you think, well, how am I actually going to do that? And usually if something's pretty novel, it's going to be hard to bring it to life. So you're going to kill it. You're going to be like, oh, I don't know, that's too hard. So then you have to notice and synthesize in a way that's sort of not guaranteed to be productive, right? You have to just be like, I'm going to notice, I'm not really going to think about executing it, and we'll see what happens. And sometimes that's a total dead end. And other times it's like a complete breakthrough. But we're so worried about being productive that it gets in the way because we kill the idea because we're worried about how to make it happen. And then it gets in the way because we're not even willing to just take this time to, float. But then, when everyone asks some successful person about like, how do they do it? It's never, oh my God, I just, have meetings all day. It's always, I get sleep, I have this morning routine, I read a lot of books. It's all this very indirectly productive or unproductive stuff. But, it feels dangerous or something. It feels like you're wasting time, but that's how you make leaps,
Yeah. So it seems like one of the obstacles to becoming a noticer is the people are concerned with the immediate metrics and KPIs, right? That they're presented with.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk a bit about the difference between purpose and goals, but I think within organizations, everybody's trying to figure out how to boost their KPI, increase this in some monotonic way. But also, I was talking to my students just the other day. We had our first class session just this past week, and I said, okay, look, after you're done reading the case and talking about it, you got to figure out some time where you let it bounce around, and if you pick up your phone and start YouTubing, the minute you have 2 seconds of dead time, like this processing is probably not going to happen. I mean, is that what's kind of getting in the way? I mean, is there a way that you can sharpen that?
I think so. I think
talent?
Yeah, you're hitting on to that. Like I think we tend to fill every second with something that even if it's not a meeting, we're consuming media, especially, right? Like you walk 100 yards from the building to the parking garage, and like dare you not to look at your phone once. Right? The fact that we feel like we need, like, oh, it's just like a pull, right? And we didn't used to be that way, but it has become like this, like double checking or the filling of space has become an interesting default. I'm doing just like a little background interest of mine is exploring where inspiration comes from. And the other day I was thinking about this, and my instinct was to right away like go to Google Scholar and look up the science of who's studying inspiration and where like get like an understanding. And then I said, no, like what if instead like I really park that to be something that I will get to eventually. But for now, I just want to talk to people about what that means to them and where it comes from and notice it in other ways. Like it was definitely a conscious shift to consume a topic in a way that wasn't like via the media that already exists. It doesn't mean I won't get to it, but I think we have to be a little bit more deliberate with that with ourselves right now.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested, when you think about maps, for instance, um, we have a tendency to think that there is one, objective way to represent uh, space. And of course, there isn't. I mean, there's an almost infinite number of ways to represent space. But it seems like our perception of the space is dictated by the map that we choose. I mean, i- how do we foster or encourage people to, map switch, right? Or, you know, mix up their stories, mix up their narratives, mix up their models, mix up their frameworks so that they can experience, I was going to say the same thing in different ways, but you're actually experiencing different things when you have those different
Yeah.
maps, right?
No, I love that you're bringing this up and when you want to talk about maps because I could do this for hours. And let me just underline too that I think a map is beyond the geographic, but like it can be, as you said, Greg, like a framework or a chart or anything that uses both the visual and the spatial dimensions to convey information. And one exercise that works really well to do just what you're saying is like grab 5 items from your backpack or your purse or like your kitchen and lay them out on a continuum, like a line with 2 arrows, and decide how you're going to lay them out. So maybe if you're in your kitchen and you've grabbed a bunch of food from your fridge, you might lay it out by um, expiration date from, expiring soon to will last forever. And now keep those same 5 items and say, I'm going to map this differently. Like, what's a whole different continuum? Well, it could be from things that fill me up to things that leave me wanting more food. It could be, things that traveled far to get to me to things that are produced locally. And the more and more, like the same items, more and more each time is a new lens. And it forces you to think about those same things, new facets of them in different ways. It works every time. Right. And it's just like new waves, new lenses on the same information to uncover that different map.
There's a fundamental mindset shift under there as well that I think is worth exploring a little bit. A lot of the actions that we do during a day are based on our knowledge. They're based on the idea that we know something, we rely on a certain way of doing things, and we're going to keep doing that thing. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, why reinvent things that you're already good at? But if you step back for a second and think about it, the amount that you don't know has to just far exceed what you do know, right? You have to be more ignorant than you are knowledgeable, just mathematically, at least in a group of people, right? The other 10 people that you're with, if you're in a group of 11, they're going to know more than you combined, right? So if you can start to get excited about that, like, oh my God, there's something to discover here, then it becomes very natural to try on different ways to look at something because you're trying to figure out what you're missing. And I think as we go into this world where it just feels like things are changing very quickly, you're just always going to be missing something because even if you're up to speed, as soon as something changes, you're not up to speed anymore. So I think it's worth getting into not trying to figure things out, but to try to understand what you're missing so that you can have a better chance of kind of getting in the ballpark, right? So the ability, and then you have to assume that like you're wrong because you only have so many hours in a day, you're only exposed to so much, you only have the one map or the 2 maps. We have a good story in the book about how people started cutting across LA because the map, the GPS didn't have elevation and they ended up driving up this incredibly steep hill and getting stuck. So your map it's the right map. It shows where the streets are, but it's missing a huge detail, right? And we're doing that all the time as we go through life. So like, why not have fun trying to figure out what you're missing? Because it's gonna lead to better things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there is this new popularity for micro dosing, right? People are taking
Right.
psychedelics so that they can see things from a fresh perspective. I think of design thinking as or I guess that term's overused. What you're describing is sort of a non-pharmacological, way to get the same
It,
same benefits, right?
it,
Who
it,
needs
I
drugs?
think people's Yeah, people's reaction sometimes to what we're doing, at other parts of the university, they'll come over and, hang out with us for the day. And I think like the first hour can feel like that. Like, why are we, mapping objects, or why are we talking about that thing in a way that's like totally orthogonal to the way most people normally talk about it? And how can we go an hour without really landing it? Right? Because sometimes it takes, weeks to find the right frame. But if you think about that, so let's say it takes me 2 weeks to frame a problem, 2 entire weeks. That's all I'm doing is trying to frame this problem. Well, then I'm going to invest, say, 2 years into producing it, right? Does that 2 weeks seem like it was worth it when you're talking about 2 years worth of and millions of dollars worth of production? It's absolutely worth it, right? But when you're in the middle of it, it feels kind of weird. It feels kind of bizarre. It just doesn't feel like it's going to pay off right away. And it's risky to sit in that space of not paying off. People get uncomfortable.
That seems like a relatively low ratio. What is it? Was it Abe Lincoln who said, if I have 10 minutes to cut down a tree, I'm going to spend, 9 minutes sharpening my axe.
Yes, that's very true.
A couple minutes walking around the tree and
absolutely
checking it out.
Yes.
Yeah. It's sort of something that's not just like, okay, hard work. It's something where if you bang up against something, maybe you try something else, and then you try something else, and then you try from a different perspective and a different angle, right? Rather
Yeah,
than
it's this tolerance of ambiguity. And so we talk about ambiguity a lot too. Just before we're talking here, I was meeting with a student who had finished our graduate master's program last year, a very successful student. And after we're chatting a bit, I started asking him about how did this work for you? Like, why were you able to be as productive as you were? Like what worked? Like, what mindset did you have? What advice would you give to other students going through this now? And one of the key things that he highlighted was that, like, one, he was open to being pushed and given feedback along the way, and 2, that he was pursuing multiple things in parallel, right? And he didn't quite know what was going to pan out. He wasn't all in on this one, it was general, the same topic area, but like approaching this topic from many different angles at once, because you just, you don't know what's going to be that thing that inspires you, that like is that click of here's the way it should go. And I think that there's a thing with that, is knowing and that, or having that tolerance for the ambiguity, because it's going to pay off in the end. And that some of these things that you did put quite a bit of work in may not end up panning out, but they actually were in service of you realizing that this other thing was the right thing. Because sometimes you need to see 5 things not work out to know that this other thing really does have legs.
Well, are there certain domains where that's more important? I mean, I remember in my class just recently, I said, hey, a lot of you are engineers, and you're going to be very uncomfortable in this strategy class, because as an engineer, you don't want to have any ambiguity about whether your bridge is going to fall or not, right? You're building that bridge. You want to know, hey, that thing is going to stand.
Right.
Whereas there are other domains, and so I've spoken with one of our colleagues, Charles O'Reilly, a couple of years ago on this podcast. We talked about the trade-off between explore and exploit, right? And how it's not that one is better than the other. It kind of depends on the situation. Are we in a world now where we need more of the kind of thinking you're describing? I mean, is it a function of the pace of change that we're experiencing?
I think it's several things. Yes. So I would say yes would be my answer. And I think the reason is both the pace of change and the scale of change, right? So we're getting bigger things faster. And I feel like when you're getting bigger things faster, it's more important that you've got it right? Because these things are going to scale up very quickly. That can cause trouble very quickly, or it can lead to, new opportunities very quickly. And there's definitely a feeling as things are speeding up that you shouldn't slow down, that you shouldn't take the time to figure out what you're doing, because if you do, it's too late. But I think anytime you're in an innovation cycle, anytime you're trying to bring something new to the world, that framing of the problem is super critical, because you aren't building completely. You are, building somewhat, but you're not building completely on what came before. So you're in ignorance territory even more. So you really need to figure out, like, am I on the right track? Am I on the right track? Am I on the right track? That's why in whatever version of like design, innovation, lean startup, whatever, you see these like constant experiments, right? Like it's, I'm going to take a stab at this. I'm not going to invest too much. I'm going to see what works, because you're just trying to figure out what you don't know. And so I think like that exploring, that trying to frame, that trying to figure out what's going on, that ability to step back and notice, those get more important as things get faster and more unknown. But our tendency is to do exactly the opposite, because we're worried we're gonna get left behind.
Yeah, and in the book, I think you talk a lot about responsibility and how people need to think about the impact that they're having. I have a friend who teaches ethics in a business school, and he says that instead of teaching things like deontology and utilitarianism, all he does is talk about psychology, because he thinks that the biggest obstacle to ethical behavior in business is just a failure to think through what it is that you're doing, right? And the impact it's going to have. And he doesn't feel like he needs to tell you what you ought to be doing. He sort of takes that for granted. He just says you need to be more aware of what and how. I mean, is that sort of your message also? That if people come in with or without their ethics, and then if you want to be responsible, then it's about thinking through the consequences and thinking through the way in which things happen. Is that how you think of kind of responsibility and ethics in the book?
I mean, responsibility for sure, right? When you launch your new product in the world, if you are running a system or you're running an organization, no matter what your sphere of work is, right? Responding not just in the moment, but thinking through what is the trace of this going to be in time. I think that's a vector that we're talking more and more about in design work, is like, what is that future that we are leaving for our descendants? So this is way less reactionary and giving results to our shareholders, right? But more thinking like, who has a stake X number of years from now in this work? I might maximize profits in the near term, but it's just going to have an outsized environmental impact in 15 years time. And like thinking through like all those consequences of one thing happens and it may affect another in a positive and in a negative way. And we do a bunch of that mapping, futures wheel mapping, as our colleague Lisa K. Solomon says, thinking through the potential consequences of our work. Because if we've already thought about them possibly happening, right, like we build them into our workflows now, right? We build in that noticing and the scale of time into our workflow.
Yeah, we have a quote in the book that we attribute to Lucille Ball because she said it, but I'm not sure exactly where it came from, but that responsibility is the ability to respond. And I think that's a nice way to think about it. So like because I think a lot of people don't want to take responsibility. It's almost like assumed that you should try to have as little responsibility as possible. Right? Like I only want to be responsible for what I must be responsible for. But the more you take into account, the better you're going to be, just even selfishly, at being able to respond to things that you may not have noticed, or that might have been created by the thing that you made. And I think there's actually in the generation that we're teaching right now, there's a shift. Like they want responsibility, and they're kind of flabbergasted that other generations haven't taken it, and they come in, they have the same zeal for doing something good in the world that's going to have an impact and avoid harm and fixing it if it happens, as like people 20 years ago did in just like creating the new biggest startup that has no liability and just gets out into the world. They have a similar zeal for that, and I think it just makes a lot of sense.
But I mean, you also say that people need to try out a bunch of different norths, right? Play around with a bunch of different objectives, which I guess economists would say, think carefully about trade-offs. And you also talk about constraints and how constraints are sort of the source of design. Like design is the sum of all the constraints. How do you think about constraints? 'Cause a lot of people would say, "Hey, I thought the purpose of design was to supersede these constraints, and, blow through these constraints, expand these constraints, and push them, and so forth."
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways to look at that. One, there is a little bit of truth to that, right? Like a designer will seem to transcend present constraints. Like, I don't know, take the iPhone, right? That seemed to like upend all these previous constraints. But actually what they're doing is they're crafting a new set of constraints to build toward. And when you do have constraints, you get something amazing, right? Like when you can pick the right constraints, meaning the ones that matter to the people who are going to use your product, the ones that matter to how it operates in the world. When you pick the right ones, that's when you get these lasting, amazing things. And actually, I think one of the things that is pretty tricky as we sort of transcend constraint after constraint with technology. Take plastic as an example. Forget the environmental impact, which is a total disaster, right? Complete disaster. Just look at the products that are made out of plastic. They are so not as special and not as wonderful and not as timeless as the ones that had to just work with like metal and wood and leather and these sort of predetermined constraints because that's all we had. Those things, because they're natural, they just look great together. They feel good. They hold up over time. They wear well. Then we get to like, oh, now we can create plastics. It can be whatever shape we want. It can weigh whatever we want. We can put whatever we want in there. And you get stuff that's just like junky. It's not as nice. There's a reason why, if you look at the trajectory, say, of the iPhone, in the middle around like version 3 and 4 and 5, they went to a plastic back. And then they immediately went back to these like glass and steel and titanium because like those materials in the constraints that they're being natural materials, they just feel better. They look better. They're just better. So the idea of transcending constraints is appealing. But what designers are doing, I think, is shifting the realm of like what they're saying, no, these are the constraints that matter. This other one that we thought mattered doesn't matter. And they're really just hell bent on figuring out like what are the set of constraints that work.
So, I mean, should we be trying on constraints like, like suits, just to sort of see what happens if you remove some options from your choice set?
Absolutely. I mean, actually, it's a wonderful exercise to help you be probably more generative, right? If you have to, if you have like the easy one, right? Is like if you have 10 minutes to come up with 20 ideas for a product, great. You can do that and you'll do that fast because you know you have to be within that time limit. If you need to come up with 20 products that use grasses within them, like as an added constraint too, right? Like immediately I'm thinking about like what that material affords and what you can do with it that you can't do with other things. Right? Like the constraint allows you to tune into that and anchor on it as a way of like what might be. And so using that as a tool for coming up with possibility is useful to anybody.
The heavier the weight, the stronger the muscle.
Yeah. And I think, that old phrase, necessity is the mother of invention, is like, well, the necessity, there's your constraint, and then you're inventing something to respond to it, right?
Yes. So I'm wondering, everything I know about the D.school going back to its earliest days, it was this place that it didn't have degree programs. If people would come in from business, come in from law, come in from engineering, and then they would kind of, like get this workout. Right? But now it seems like it's offering degrees and so forth. Does that change how we should be thinking about design? I mean, I'm always puzzled when I hear about people that are design professionals. I'm like, well, what does that mean? Designer of what? Right? Like, if somebody says they're a graphic designer, okay, I get that. If somebody says that they are a, device designer, like I get that. But what does it mean to be like a designer? full stop. Is there such a thing? Is there such a profession or an occupation? Does that make sense to think of someone as a universal designer?
I think Scott and I would call ourselves designers, so I'd say yes for sure, right? And I'll tell you this. So the D.school is still a place where people from around the university, no matter what school you're within, whatever you're majoring in, you can come and take classes. And that interdisciplinarity is rooted in our DNA and it's still incredibly important to us. And now we do offer both a bachelor's degree in design as well as a 2-year master's program in design. And the structure behind those 2 degrees, and I'll zoom in on the bachelor's degree because these are students that are like, this is what they want to major in because they do see themselves as designers at some point in their career. Part of their work is an engineering background because we're within a school of engineering. Part of their work is a core sequence of design courses that includes things that we've been talking about, like ethics throughout, like ways of making and building that try on both traditional types of media as well as ones that are more emerging or mischievous and fleeting, like algorithms and genetic code, right? It's like there's this materiality that they experiment with. And then really importantly is we have them each focus on what we call like a domain. So this is a context with which they are interested in applying design work. Those domains might be climate and environment or health and healthcare, right? So there's things like there's these big spaces and they find their path through that domain because it's designed as applied to this area that really could use a designer who is somebody who both, again, like for before, like can see the big picture about what might be possible, what's needed, what that desirability is, and they can articulate and execute on what those details are.
Yeah, and I think another way to look at it is like, people call themselves business people, right? I'm a business person and they run a business, right? It's like design people and designers, it's very similar. It's kind of getting to that place where if business people are worried about the viability, how does this have financial sustainability? Designers are worried about this desirability, like how is this used? Is it something people want? Is it something that's going to be good for, the world or the ecosystem that I'm in? And it is getting to that point because the tools are getting more accessible, right? So we still need the way in engineering or in science, you have particular, like I'm a structural engineer or I'm an electrical engineer. You need those to be able to work at that level. You still need graphic designer, industrial designer. You still need those, but it is moving as well into the space where it's like, an engineer might become like a CTO, right? So there's a generalist engineer too, and it's I think they're a generalist and specific of all of them, right? You might be a finance person versus being a CEO or versus, being a product manager. It's the same with design.
Yeah, no, I have to end with one last question. You end the book with an imperative. You tell everybody to go and be a good jig. I have to admit that I didn't even know what a jig was until I read this. So tell us what you mean by that and what the implications are.
So a jig is the tool that you use to make the thing you're making. So you'll build something. It's particularly in like metalworking and woodworking. It allows you to make sure that what you're building goes through whatever tool you have the same way every time, and you get some consistency. So people build these kind of intricate structures in order to build the thing that they're building. They guide the material through, say, a circular saw or a bandsaw or whatever it might be. And there's just something special about them. When you see a good woodworker, they'll have them like all over the wall, like they'll have the parts and pieces that they need to put them together. And it's really just an understanding of when you're putting things out into the world, the way that you put them out into the world is just as important as what you put out into the world. And you, in a sense, can be the kind of person who's creating things that create things. You're tending to the things that we make. When you make something, it's not just about what you're making, it's about how you're making it too. And I sign a lot of the books when people ask for that, embarrassingly. I'll sign Be a Good Jig, and then I'll like write the page number because they have no idea. It's my way to get them to the end of the book. But it's really about just like a different way of looking at things. Like, how do we tend to things? How do we make sure we're able to, be the people that are creating things that we want in the world?
So it's like you're a tool maker, but you're also a jig maker, but you're also a jig, right? So you have to
You're a
focus
jig in itself. Well,
Yeah, what
if
you're
you think about parenting, right? Like, you're a jig for your kids, so like the way you behave around your kids is going to create or help at least create or influence the personality of your kids. So if you're a parent, you're a jig for your kids. If you're a teacher, you're a jig for those students. If you're a leader, you're a jig for the people you're working with. And just
I think
own it and enjoy it,
I think that takes us back to the beginning of the book, which is that, we are all designers, I guess, and we are consciously and unconsciously designing things as we walk through our lives, whether we realize it or not. So let's bring it to the surface and make sure that we are doing it a bit more intentionally. Carissa and Scott, thanks so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. The book is called Assembling Tomorrow. Enjoyed it and hope to talk again soon, next time in person, perhaps.
Thanks so much, Greg.
Great chatting with you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.